Late 19th century American Woman's Nature Poetry and the Evolution of the Imagist Poem by Paula Bennett, Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. The point de repère, usually and conveniently taken as the starting point of modern poetry, is the group-dominated Imagist in London about 1910, T.S. Eliot. End quote. While researching Emily Dickinson's for my last book, I became aware that 19th century poetry by American women formed an enormous body of lost work to which Dickinson was heavily, if silently, indebted. After completing the book, I began collecting this poetry for a projected anthology. Working for A to Z, I skimmed every 19th century periodical, gift book, and anthology in the Widener Library collection at Harvard University, zeroing poems of sufficient quality to merit possible inclusion. Within 3 months, I had collected more than 600 poems, the majority drawn from such prestigious literary magazines as The Atlantic Monthly, Century, Harper's, Galaxy, the Midlands Monthly, the Overland Monthly, and Scribers. More to the point, I had a radically revised view of the development of women's poetry in the United States. A view that, among other things, now situates Dickinson's stylistic and thematic innovation firmly within a bourgeoisie women's poetry movement occurring between 1859 and 1900. In this article, I would like to share some of what I have discovered about women's nature poetry in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. I then wish to speculate on the connection between this poetry and that produced by women's poets in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, in particular by those women poets whom literary historians following Urza Pound's initiative have chosen to call Imagists. On the basis of the poems I have collected, I now believe that a direct line can be demonstrated between women poets writing in the late 19th century and the major women poets of the early modernism. More than that, it can be shown that stylistic and thematic changes in women's poetry between the late 1850s and 1890s, changes that, among other things, help account for the surprisingly positive reception of Dickinson's poetry enjoyed in 1890 on first publication, are basic to the evolution of the early modernist poem. If Emily Dickinson had written today, Grace S. Muser observes in her 1896 review essay of Dickinson's work, she would have found herself in the full sweep of the art movement, which contends for originality and freshness of expression at the sacrifice of every art form, instead of the hackneyed which is powerless to really express. End quote. Buckingham 476. The art movement to which Muser alludes was no new birth. It was the product of changes that had been occurring in women's poetry in particular over the preceding 4 decades. In effect, over the period in which Dickinson herself wrote in the next 2 decades, between 1900s and 1920, this movement would burst into bloom in the phenomenon we call early modernism. But the soil had been prepared years before, and in this preparation the work of bourgeoisie American women poets, especially those writing about nature or writing poems heavily dependent upon nature imagery. As for example, many of H.D.'s and Emmy Lowell's poems was crucial. By the end of the 1850s, marked formal and thematic shifts began to appear in the bourgeoisie women's nature poetry that helped lay the foundations for the early modernist lyric. To illustrate how striking these shifts can be, I would like to take two poems published in the same June 1859 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, Dickinson's favorite magazine, reading Caps 128 to 34, 148. The first poem, Spring, by A.C. Brackett, and a Calendar, is a strictly conventional treatment of its familiar subject. Indeed, it is a poem that would have been equally at home in any of the period's many religiously based ladies' magazines, the primary outlet in the United States for bourgeoisie women's poetry until the late 1850s. Like other poems of its type, Calendar's Spring displays the hackneyed language to which Musler alludes, and on which the sentimental poetry of an earlier generation of writers, male and female, notoriously depended. I quote the first two stanzas as, "Ah, my beautiful violets, stirring under the sod, feeling in all your being the breath of the Spirit of God, thrilling your delicate pulses, warming your lifeblood anew. Struggle up into the spring light. I'm watching and waiting for you. Stretch up with your white arms toward me. Climb and never despair. Come. The blue sky is above you. Sunlight and soft warm air. Shake off the sleep from your eyelids. Work in the darkness a while. Trust in the light that's above you. Win your way up to its smile." Spring's confused yet ultimately rich blending of erotic and spiritual impulses, its inspirational quality, and its subordination of the speaker's individual voice and situation to a public persona, a subordination mediated through the very conventionality of its language, are typical of the names of the nature poetry bourgeoisie women produced in the great quantities throughout the first half of the century. As Annie Finch argues, the lack of a privileged central self in conjunction with the elevation of public, communally shared values such as religion and family love is what gives this poetry that quality we have defined as sentimental, and alienates it from the contemporary post-romantic canons of aesthetic taste. In such poetry which, because of the very publicness which it treats personal, or better, domestic emotion, I would like to call high sentimental. The conventionality of the speaker's discourse is the poem's essence, and at least part of its appeal. Such poetry is not meant to be a vehicle for the poet's idiosyncratic psyche, or uniquely personal vision, nor does it claim to be. Rather, it speaks in the unified voice of a singular cultural point of view, a view in that addresses, as it were, in public language, that values and concerns of women's quote-unquote private sphere, and which finds in nature a relatively unproblematic reflection of women's i.e., the violet's relation to God. But if this is true, then the second poem, Bloodroot by Emily S. Foreman, published in the same issue of The Atlantic, takes a giant step towards a very different aesthetic and a very different point of view, for in this poem's extraordinary specificity, as well as in its multiple ambiguities, the individualized subjectivity that presumably characterizes the modern lyrical voice, a voice that claims to inscribe the uniqueness of a personal and frequently alienated vision, can be clearly heard. Beech trees, stretching their arms rugged yet beautiful, here shade meadow and brook, here the gay bobolink, high poised over his mate, pours out his melody. Here too under the hill blooms the wild violet. Damp nooks hide near the brook bellworts that modestly, pale-faced, hanging their heads, droop there in silence, while south winds, noiseless and fresh, bring us the odor of birch twigs mingled with fresh buds of the hickory. Hard by, clinging to rocks, nods the red columbine. Close hid under the leaves nestle anemones. White-robed, airy, and frail, tender and delicate. Ye who, wandering here, seeking the beautiful, stoop down, thinking to pluck one of these favorites. Take heed, nymphs may avenge. List to a prodigy. One moon scarcely has waned since I here witnessed it. One moon scarcely has waned since, on a holiday, I came, careless and gay, into this paradise, found here, wrapped in their cloaks, made of a leaf, little white flowers, pure as snow, modest and innocent, stooped down, eagerly plucked one of the fairest when forth rushed, fresh from the stem, broken thus wickedly. Blood, tears red as of blood, shed through my selfishness. It is not just the metrical sophistication, the enjambment, forced pauses, and use of assonance in preference to rhyme that distinguishes this poem from Calendar Spring, nor is it simply Foreman's greater attention to detail. The many concrete and accurate specifics, the birch tree, violets, and anemones, the birch twigs mingling with fresh buds of hickory that mark Bloodroot, as written in a different voice. Foreman has used her poem to tell a story. The story is a complicated and elusive one, told possibly, albeit ambiguously, by a speaker who may or may not be male. It deals with a careless seduction, a bloody and painful loss of innocence, very possibly a literal, but at the least a spiritual rape. And in telling the story, however elusively, Foreman has radically altered her or our relation to language, to convention, to poetry itself, by setting her poem at the moment of fall rather than, as does Calendar, at the moment of redemption. She has irrevocably separated it, and us, her readers, from the communally shared values such as religion and family love, upon which high sentimentalism depended, on which, as Anne Douglas has demonstrated, accounted for so much that was unconventional or hackneyed in the expression paragraph 254 to 56 and past them, the white-armed violets that safely climb towards the light and never despair, precisely because they know a beneficent God is watching them. For the bloodroot there is no safety, neither is in light nor in shadow. It is raped where it hides, wrapped in its cloak. And this changed point of view in a changed style as well, at once more ambiguous, more complex, more personal, and idiosyncratic than anything high sentimentalism, with its assumption of a benevolent and seamless divine and natural order, permitted, if Foreman's poem is indebted, as it is probably so, to classical depictions of rape in nature, from Hyacinth to Philomel. It echoes these earlier texts in order to suggest, without specifying, the poet/speaker's own reservations respecting the values and attitudes of the writers, such as the calendar who preceded and indeed still surrounded her. Drawing on one set of communally shared stories, Foreman has challenged another set to make her own personal location, her point of view, clear. Although Dickinson was receiving the Atlantic in 1859, there is no way to know whether Foreman's poem influenced her, or indeed whether she even read it. But in terms of nature poetry written by other 19th-century American women, Bloodroot is an unconventional foretaste of things to come, a movement in this poetry toward greater concrete detail, more ambiguous and flexible stylistic expressions, and toward a much wider and more disturbing range of themes and voices than high sentimentalism. With its commitment to religiously based domestic and cultural values, allowed by 1859 the intellectual structure supporting high sentimentalism was in fact under siege in virtually every quarter of the culture, from the women's rights movement to the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, eloquently defended by C.J. Sparge in the 1866 Atlantic. It is not surprising, therefore, that the poetry which depended upon this structure would also undergo radical transformation in the years immediately to come. Nor is it surprising that the voices of individual women poets would begin to emerge with a particularity that A did not possess before. As such, women poets struggled in her own way to reconcile her new knowledge and a sense of self with her with her relation to her craft and with changes in culture at large. I do not have the space here, nor is it necessary, to trace this transformation as it occurred step by step between 1859 and 1880. Suffice it to say that by 1880, American women were writing a very different kind of nature poem than they wrote prior to 1859. Not only is it much of the vagueness and hackneyed form of expression gone, at least in the most effective examples of their poetry, but the perspective has changed as well. Writers turn from voicing publicly held values to what I would call poetry of quote-unquote private, or better perhaps privatized vision. In these poems, the domestic and spiritual commonplaces that dominated the first half of the century gave way to the speaker's own personal and often unarticulated relationship to the natural phenomena. She describes these poets still. She describes these poets still identify strongly with nature and write about it, or in reference to it, constantly, but the significance they attribute to nature is considerably harder to determine. For some, as in Margaret Deland's extraordinary Noon in a New England Pasture, published in August 1887, Harper's New Monthly Magazine, the natural world has been completely secularized, and no framework of values, traditional or otherwise, sustains it. It accepts perhaps those values generated within it. With scattered birch the pasture slope is crowned, the sunburnt grass that clings to mountainsides, cropped by small mouths of timid sheep, scarce hides, like a scant cloverlet, the hard, dry ground, though through which the stony ledge or rocky knee, the strong wind breaks, the strong world breaks, the ragged ferns that fill each dimple on the shoulders of the hill, rustle with faint, sharp sound, if but the bee slips through their stems to find his mossy nest. With a thick, soft, wilted leaves, the mulleins grow, like tall, straight candles with pale yellow glow. Their stalks star-flowered toward the cloudless west. The crooning cricket with an endless song jars the hot silence. The crumbling fence is grayed by the slow creeping lichen, held and stayed by arms of wandering rose that, tough and strong, bind firm its slipping stones, the rusty briar, and scarlet fingers of the bitter sweet cast a light shade that shelters from the heat. A thousand voiceless little lives higher than maiden birch or solitary pine, poised in the brooding blue on speckled wings. A hawk hangs motionless, so straight he flings his shadow to the earth like plummet line. It drops through seas of air as in a swoon of light. The great world lies, and life stands still, wrapped in a breathless hush, till up the hill drift dappled shadows of the afternoon. There are a number of things one can observe with this poem. To begin with, it is a poem written in a specific voice, a voice differentiated, it should be noted, as much as by local as by the vision. As in Dickinson, it is a voice that sees New Englandly, unlike Calendar's spring, therefore, which could be in effect be located almost anywhere, just as it could be spoken, presumably, by almost anyone, certainly by any bourgeoisie Christian woman. The speaker's particular or individualized subjectivity, her location or positioning, is central to Deland's poem. At the same time, however, one of the poem's ironies is that this particularity is conveyed entirely at second hand. That is, we experience it objectively through the accumulation of specific details from which the speaker observes, but in which she or he has no direct part. Thus, the singularity we attribute to Deland's speaker is that the singularity she attributes to what she sees, the hard, dry, yet flower-filled land, the tough, strong roses that bind the lichen-covered slipping stones, the thick, wilted leaves of mullein, the plummeting shadow of the hawk. These are individuating details or images that compose this poem, They, or rather the speaker's relation to them, or the values the speaker assigns them, or perhaps even finds in them, are what the poem is all about. And they are its all. And because they are all, both linguistically and in terms of content, Noon in a New England Pasture stands on the very brink of the modern world, ultimately isolating in its vision, at least in respect to social and religious concerns. This poem preaches no lesson, draws no moral, references no God, seeks to enunciate no communal value system. In such a poem, the natural world stands outside any reference to a transcendent vision or an explanatory metaphysics. Although most assuredly a modern sense of nature divorced from transcendent meaning underlies and sustains it, rather like the Wallace Stevens jar, which to my mind represents the quintessential modern poem/object. The New England pasture Deland evokes in his poem simply is, that is, it is a collective aesthetic object that presents itself as its own excuse for contemplation. The values it projects are those inherent in the disorder and harmony of the natural world. Even more than the great body of Dickinson's nature poetry, which suspends itself ambiguously between multiple and contradictory possibilities. Deland's poem seems to me, therefore, to look forward to a truly modern point of view and aesthetic. The apparent originality and freshness of its language, to return to Musler's terms, are, I would suggest, a function of Deland's need to find in the material reality, perhaps even an immanence, comforts and pleasures religion and culture could no longer provide. Written, as David Porter would say, in the aftermath, this poem assumes an aestheticized perspective on a natural world, in which the absence of a transcendent meaning may be the only meaning worth reporting back, but which the nevertheless provides in consolations, in beauty, in harmony, in sensual pleasure of its own. Porter 9-24. While Noon in a New England Pasture is an unusually successful poem, it is not the only poem of its kind. On the contrary, what happens in it was happening generally in women's nature poetry by the last decade of the 19th century. Although never as radically as Dickinson's, the future stylistic freshness of this poetry is a function of these poets' changing view of reality. For some women, as for some men, this new view of reality, the combined product of Darwinism, scientific revolution, cultural transformation, and the breakdown of traditional moral and religious values, was terrifying. And they could, on occasion, voice an Arnoldian despair, as does Celia Thaxter, for example in the concluding stanza of the highly troubled and conflicted poem Starlight, 1878. Starlight and silence, dumb are sky and sea, silent as death the awful spaces lie, speechless the bitter winds blow over me, sad as the breathing of a human sigh. Or, as does Charlotte Perkins Stenson Gilman in the trenchant last lines of A Common Interference, a poem whose bizarre surrealistic atheism and bitter irony matches Stephen Crane's equally bitter and persuasive expulations from the deep. And everywhere in happiness and peace, a million life forms of life that never cease, and one small ant heap crushed by passing tread hath scarce enough alive to mourn the dead. They shriek beneath the sod, there is no God. But if the growing secularization of nature eclipsed despair in some poets, it also helped produce the kind of early modernist nature poem I am describing here. That is, it helped to produce the poems in which the imagery, in which the accuracy of individuated details or images, finally the poem's reason for being, and in which meaning was indeterminate because the framework of communally held religious and domestic values had been removed, and poems, that is, in which the image speaks for itself, and for the poem/poet to use Pound's terms, revealing whatever there is to be revealed. In such poems as I believe in Imagist poetry generally, art begins to take the place of nature as the focal point of the poet's interest. For example, in the first two stanzas of Lillian Shuey's 1892 In Mendocino, here the poet's attempt to convey this visual experience of the ocean leads her to create patterns of repetition, including assonance and alliteration, which dominate any other value the scene which might possess, and are the means through which emotion and meaning are simultaneously conveyed. The breath of the sea and the cypress, of misty and pungent air, shadows of tall trees bending into the bright sea glare, the white sea washing the headlands, the white gulls wheeling home, dipping their wings in the breakers, and treading the swift sea foam. Or, as in Martha T. Tyler's April, a brief and not altogether successful spring poem, published in 1893, which begins with a resonant inquiry. Crocuses, a morning meadow, apple blossoms lightly stirred, sudden rain, a wild bird's shadow, with the shadow, which the bird, which the bird, which the shadow, which the bird. In such writing as in Deland's and Dickinson's in certain moods, art has absorbed nature. No distinction can be made between shadow and bird, between object and representation, between the patterns the poet describes and the scenes she witnessed. The poem and the world are one. The world, no wider than the poet's eye, is ordered, shaped, defined by the poet's tongue. It is, in short, or has become, a poetic object, an image, and however beautiful or revelatory this image object, this poem world, it references finally only itself. From such passages, with their concision and their emphasis upon the aestheticized object, it is but a short step, therefore, to the far more radical formal experimentation formed in nature poetry. Women published an avant-garde chapbook between 1894 and 1898. For this poetry, which unequivocally functions as a precursor to the early modernist lyrics of poets such as Amy Lowell, H.D., and Pound, is also unequivocally the product of a purely aesthetic orientation toward the natural world. Here, for example, is Creation by Eleanor B. Cadwell. Aeons of time, infinite space, blackness and chaos interlace. Suddenly a streak of light shot through, on a pinhead of earth, a red cock crew. With a cunning metrical allusion to Poe, here is Flying Fish by Mary McNeill Scott, the future wife of Ernest Frenosola. Scott also wrote pseudo-oriental lyrics a good 20 years before Pound, at her behest, put his stamp upon her husband's work. Stedman, 739-40. Out where the sky and sky blue sea merge in a mist of sheen, there started a vision of silver things, a leap and a quiver and a flash of wings. The sky and the sea between. Is it of birds from the blue above, or fish from the depths that be, or is it the ghost in silver hosts of birds that were drowned at sea? And finally, here is Anne Devore's An Electric Light Pole, not particularly successful in itself. This poem nevertheless presents a stunning anticipation of Pound's most well-known Imagist poem, In a Station of the Metro. Like Pound, Devore juxtaposes the technological and the natural, the electric light pole with the blossoming tree, using concise images of the dark and light in order to illuminate, as it were, a modernist perspective on the modern world. O boughless tree that bars the sky, all naked, grim, and stark, your blossoms in 100 homes bloom out and light the dark. Aside from precision and novelty and the deliciousness of the obscurity that impresses in these poems, they are playful poems, poems in which the author speakers are recognizing, as it were, the radical meaninglessness of the world, substitute sharply defined aesthetic effects for what we would ordinarily call common sense. That is, they are self-consciously art, precisely the kind of self-conscious art to which Musser was probably referring when she alluded in 1896 to an art movement. And if this self-conscious artistness links them to Emily Dickinson and later Wallace Stevens, on the one hand, it links them on the other to the artfulness of their most immediate precursors and postcursors, to Deland and Shuey, as well as to Pound, Amy Lowell, and H.D. Here, for instance, is Lowell's Autumn, 1917, a typical example of Boston poets' presumably Pound-inspired Oriental imitations. All day I have watched the purple vine leaves fall into the water, and now in the moonlight they still fall, but each leaf is fringed with silver. And here is H.D.'s Oread, one of the early group of poems to which Pound affixed the label Imagist, thus effectively severing the poem from the woman's tradition to which, for all her Grecian hardness, she initially belonged. Whirl up, sea, whirl your pointed pines, splash your great pines on our rocks, hurl your green over us, cover us with your pools of fur. In respect to the poetry I have been describing, Lowell's and H.D.'s use of free verse, like Pound's, unquestionably represents a new and significant departure, making possible a spareness rhymed verse finds difficult to achieve, but every other element of their poems, from their drive toward concision to their emphasis on aesthetic effect, and on concrete, arresting details to present nature, nature whose spiritual values, in as so far as it has any, can be no longer be linked to communally held Christian eschatological beliefs, and had already been established in women's nature poetry by 1895. After decades of arduous work, if, as Sirena N. Pondrum eloquently argues, H.D.'s lyrics serve Pound as the model for Imagist poem, then the work of precursor women poets who Pound, Lowell, and H.D. along with Dickinson failed to acknowledge, was vital to this poem's and this style's evolution, whatever other influences may also have been brought to bear. What am I saying in short is that what the early modernists added to make the Imagist poem free verse was hardly more crucial than what they found. All the other elements of the Imagist poem waiting for them in the poetry that women in particular have been developing over the preceding 50 years use no superfluous word, no adjective that does not reveal something. Pound declaimed in his famous 1913 set of don'ts for Imaginists. Don't use such an expression as dimlins of peace. It dulls the image. It mixes an abstraction with the concrete. It comes with the writers not realizing that the natural object is always the adequate symbol. Literary Essays 4 to 5, my italics. Yet in 1912, 25 years after Deland and 18 years after Cadwell, Pound, in his obsessive need to imitate the voices of the past, could still write in one poem, "Be in me as the eternal moods of the bleak wind, and not, as transient things are, gaiety of flowers. Have me in this strong loneliness of sunless cliffs and of gray waters." Persone 67. And in another, sounding very much like Emily Foreman, only less specific. "No, no, go from me. I have still the flavor, soft as the spring wind that comes from birchen flowers. Green comes the shoots, April in the branches." Persone 71. Nor with the exception of Stephen Crane, John B. Tabb, and a few free verse experiments by T.E. Humley and Edward Storer, have I found any male poet, British or American, who was doing appreciably better, not even, although some might wish to disagree, William Butler Yeats. Indeed, I have found very few who were, in whatever different ways, doing as well, at least where the concision and focus of the image were concerned. In Astigmatism, a poem as brutal as it is brilliant, Lowell suggests that the most significant contribution Pound made to history of American poetry in the first 2 decades of the 20th century was not the creation of the Imagist poem, or even the formulation of its laws, although this formulation was obviously central to early modernism's emerging self-consciousness as a poetic movement. His contribution was to eliminate from serious scrutiny the work of all women poets who did not meet, as Dickinson would say, his criterion for tune, number 285. Among them, ironically, Minnie Lowell herself was eager to dismiss. Walker 19 to 22. having marched through the meadow and woodland, decapitating unacceptable flowers with his high phallic cane. Pound's persona, the poet in this poem, comes to a garden still searching for the roses that are the only sort of flowers he allows. Astigmatism, I should note, is dedicated to Pound, with much friendship and admiration from some differences of opinion. Dahlias ripened against a wall, gillyflowers stood up bravely for all their short stature, and a trumpet vine covered an arbor with the red and gold of its blossoms, red and gold like the brass notes of a trumpet. The poet knocked off the stiff heels of the dahlias, and his cane lopped the gillyflowers at the ground. Then he severed the trumpet blossoms from their stems. Red and gold they lay scattered, red and gold as on a battlefield, red and gold prone and dying. They were not roses, said the poet. Peace be with you, brother, but behind you is destruction and waste places. Lowell 34. There is rape, and then there is rape. As in Foreman's poem, flowers here are gendered female, and clearly they do not simply represent poems. They represent the female authors of those poems as well. In the name of the male canonical judgment, these poems, Arthur Flowers, have been beheaded. Beheading in this case is deflowering. Deflowering, at least of this sort, is rape. Where women authors writing in the last 2 decades of the 19th century raped of their poems by up-and-coming male poets, British and American, whose own stylistic developments had perhaps been thwarted by editorial demands by their own desire to continue writing in mainstream poetic traditions. Here is T.E. Humel's Above the Dock, published by the Pound in Posts in 1912 and frequently cited along with Humel's 5 other poems as an example of pre-Imagist Imagism. Jones 48, Gage 88 to 89. Unlike its companion pieces that employ free verse in form and technique, Above the Dock equivocally harks back to work done by chapbook women poets 18 years before. Above the quiet dock in midnight, tangled in the tall mast-corded height, hangs the moon, what seemed so far away, is but a child's balloon, forgotten after play. And here, by the way of contrast, is the opening stanza of Spring Song by another British poet, John Davidson, which was published in the chapbook 1896. Be it remembered that the chapbook was presumably dedicated to publishing specifically avant-garde writing. About the flowerless land adventurous bees, pickering hum, the rooks divide, with many a horse astride, in solemn conclave on the budding trees, larks in the skies and ploughboys over the leas, carol as if the winter near had been. The very owl comes out to greet the sun. Rivers high-hearted run, and hedges mantle with the flush of green. In the same issue of chapbook, tucked in the final pages of Davidson's poem Open the Issue, Doria Loomis Moore published Evolution, or revisioning, as it were, of Cadwell's no less startling creation, which prepared in the magazine 2 years before. Chaos and night and silence, these then moving masses in a mystery. Sudden, a globule leaps to space and flees to light and law in history. with its larks and plowboys. Davidson's poems, like other poems by American as well as British male poets in the chapbook, it is not so much bad as simply dated. More to the woman poet willing to follow the lead of another woman poet and make her own strange leap into space. It was a good decade ahead of him and ahead of her own time. At least at the time was defined by the principal male poets of her day. Not just Davidson and Madison Caywell, Bliss Carman, Eugene Field, and Archibald Lampman, male chapbook poets all. As Andra M. Gilbert and Susan Gubar observed, by the 1870s, women poets had become the dominant voices in poetry published in the leading periodicals in the United States, 142-43. And it is in their poetry, especially their radical poetry, that many of the most radical changes in poetic style occurred between 1859 and 1900. Beginning 1900 and 1925, when in effect, men like Eliot and Pound helped bring the revised modernist canon of this poetry, which was labeled sentimental, whether or not it was lost. By the time Conrad Aiken edited the Modern Library's comprehensive anthology of American poetry in 1929, only 4 19th-century poets were deemed worthy of inclusion, whereas Stedman in his 1900 anthology had included 150. Within another 2 decades, not a single 19th-century women poet besides Dickinson could be found in anthologies devoted to American literature. It was as if the hundreds of women writing poetry during the 19th century, approximately 300 by my count, had never been. Pound's systematic judgment, a judgment from which, alas, many early modern poets concurred, had been telling. But as I have tried to show in this essay, the work of these lost poets was fundamental to the evolution of early modernist poem. Whatever other sources, both in the United States and abroad, this poem might have had, and however important the adoption of free verse in particular was to it. In conclusion, I would like to suggest that basic changes in poetic style cannot be attributed to individual authors, even the most original, such as Dickinson herself, as E.H. Gombrich was argued in respect to the visual arts, such as changes reflect shifts in cultural values, and they occurred slowly over extended periods of time as new techniques to express these values are developed by the artist evolved in 3 to 30. As in late 19th century women's natured poetry, they can be tracked almost moment to moment as specific writing strategies appear or disappear. The invention of Imagism by Pound in 1912 was one such moment. But the groundwork for this moment and for early modernist poetry as a whole had been laid decades before, in a good part by American women, nature poets who have found in nature's details the means and ends of their aesthetic effects. The reason data for their poems, it is time we return to these poets' gardens and restore their flowers whose heads the process of canonization in this century has all too effectively cut off.